Hello, I'm Anavultus, and thank you all for watching. Today I'm here with the Carnal Conservative. Please introduce yourself.
I am the Carnal Conservative, a hate agent and a web creator online for a tabletop roleplay game, as well as a commentator on political bullshit. I also have a burgeoning, continuing discussion on what true conservatism actually is throughout history and time, rather than simply confining conservatism as a force to any particular culture and people. I think that conservatism itself is a far more, um, shall we say, abstract philosophy that can be extracted throughout all people and throughout the entire course of human history. There are certain principles which conservatism almost universally seems to adhere to, despite people claiming otherwise.
Indeed, I would agree, and although I'm certain that we will probably have some disagreements ourselves, I think that we are both seeking a similar question, and of course, I'm here because I wrote a whole book on this topic, a 150-page book. It's called A Manifesto for American Conservatives, where I look back through history. It's not a history book, it's more a philosophical book, but I also look at history here and there as well, looking at what is conservatism and how does conservatism play out in various types of situations. And
Hmm.
and I use quotes from America's founding fathers, but not just them, also politicians, philosophers, statesmen throughout history. I use a wide variety of references to support various claims I make. And I think that's something that's important for conservatives is to have a connection to history and to have a system of virtues that go beyond the changes of time. That is to say,
Yeah,
beyond what you might say would be uh, the present culture, because culture changes over time. It's important
it does.
to go to your foundations, go to the roots of what it is that you're trying to conserve, and I think that that's something that's sorely missing in America's conservative movement, at least currently.
Well, it's easy to be conservative when you're in power or the things that are conservative in nature are in vogue, which for the vast majority of any population at any point in time, most people are going to lean center right. Now, the argument from the left is yes, but we're moving society to the left. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're not moving humanity in the way you think that you're moving them, because society becoming more comfortable and more stable does not mean it's becoming less conservative. Um, but I haven't read this manifesto of yours. I haven't had any interaction with these ideas that you're presenting. Your introduction is going to be the first time I'm personally exposed to these assertions and these claims, and I'm interested in hearing about them. Um, but we were just talking about the whole recent Sam Harris stuff, and what was interesting about Sam Harris and his entire diatribe was his appeal to a sense of tradition, a sense of things as they ought to be, and appealing to this as well. Trump is destroying all of these things, and what people have to understand is that that's not inherently bad. Like, there's nothing conservative about supporting your destroyer. So, uh, these are questions about conservatives and conservatism that do need addressing, that need more clarity. And I'm hoping that as we unfold your formulations, that they are uh, reasonable. So let's dive into it, my man.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that I write my book in 12 chapters, and each chapter can be considered in some ways a self-contained thesis on a particular topic, while also interacting with the other chapters to form a more holistic perspective. But anyway, the first
Okay.
chapter is on conservatism, what it is, because frequently you hear of a question, or maybe us that are more politically involved online might hear of a question, conserve what? And you might hear a million different answers to that question.
Yeah, yeah, you will.
Yeah. And I think that what this can be boiled down to is ultimately three categories of things that people are trying to conserve. The first, I would say, is virtue. So that is uh, things like morals, values, uh, religious principles, and such things. The other is order. That could be social order, stability, peace, justice, things like that. And the third one is prosperity. And this doesn't necessarily have to mean economic prosperity or being wealthy in that sense, but it just means to thrive based on the other two things that you're conserving, which is virtue and order. That is to say, if you want to conserve things, you want to succeed in conserving those things, and that is a type of prosperity. And if you want to conserve things, you need to justify that you're conserving things, and that's where the virtue comes in, asking, is this something that is worthwhile to have? And then there's, of course, the order of how are you going to conserve things and how does that play into society. So those are the three things that I think conservatives generally, and this is the broad level, are trying to conserve, and that is virtue, order, and prosperity. And I think that everything else that conservatives are trying to conserve are functions of these three.
That's interesting. I'm inclined to agree with you out of instinct, but also out of personal habit. I'm also inclined to disagree habitually. Um, I have questions about what you mean by virtue. And the reason that I have questions about virtue itself is because it almost seems like it's almost like another way of saying we uphold these principles. And in my own discovery of conservatism, I find the the impetus of conservatism to be very unprincipled, not necessarily rawly materialist or empirical, but the things that conservatives are trying, in my view, to conserve are how they survive. That seems to be the the impetus of conservatism. It has nothing to do with say virtue or principles or any form of idealism. Conservatism, from what I've gathered across cultures and time, seems to be about survival. And um, I don't know how you envisioned virtue interacting in that in that paradigm. Could you give me an example of one of the virtues that conservative, because that is another question. We say we're conservatives, and the question to that was, well, what are we conserving? And then you say, well, okay, we're conserving virtues, fine, um, or we're conserving virtue. What virtue are we conserving? What virtue are we upholding as something that is uh, something that is sacred, something that is that is worthy of preserving? What is it? What virtue are we appealing to? Because the virtue itself is a little empty.
Yeah, and of course, I don't leave it empty like that. I write a more broad definition of what virtue is and where it comes from. And I think that understanding where virtue comes from is really what helps you to get to understanding why it is important and also in what ways it can go wrong.
Ah,
So I would say virtue ultimately comes from religion. And
okay.
yes, so the definition which I use for virtue is the sum of moral principles that, when faithfully applied, allow for a good interaction with the self, the family, the community, and any higher powers. These moral principles or values should not be understood as baseless presuppositions. They are the result of religion, which used here is defined as the adherence to a set of metaphysical principles. However, what is important about religious thought for political conservatism is the idea that virtues are unchanging through history and may be known and implemented consistently over extended periods of time.
Okay.
So,
All right.
yeah,
Um, I heard what you said there, and by and large, it seems to be true. And again, um, but we do have to remember that, and I would agree that there's a large cross section between the virtues and habits and traditional mores of most faiths, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Hindu. Um, the in the East, you have the aspect of ancestor worship to replace that, which I personally find to be very wholesome. Uh, However, there's also other faiths and religions that have popped up that have been detrimental. You've had the ancient Israelite example of throwing your children through the fire of Moloch. You have the Baalites and the other, shall we say, pagan practices that did not have this virtue tenor among them. And I do have to, despite being a very religious person, I'm going to push back on this the faith aspect of this virtue. I have questions about that, and how do you respond to this um, to these questions?
well, yes, I think that there is, in some sense, as you said, there can be a broad agreement between different cultures, but there are, of course, exceptions, and the exceptions will, of course, have to be points of no compromise ultimately. That is to
Hmm.
say, we're not going to, here in America, we're not going to tell people that we're going to respect their religious practice of burning their children, for example.
Yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
and
so, so my question is that in terms of virtue and the cultural, the good and wholesome, natural cultural enforcement of uh, the basic religious virtues of honesty, truth, of dealing well with your neighbor, uh, being free of envy, all of that wonderful stuff. Where do you and you have to understand that we're interacting in a multi or interfaith dynamic. Um, what how do we discern between the virtues that need to be promoted in this interfaith Venn diagram, so to speak?
yes, well, ultimately, I would say that in America, historically, there has been a way to address this issue. And that is, of course, the idea of the separation of political and religious institutions, but not the separation of political and religious thought. So that is to say that ultimately, I will say that any political movement necessarily, because politics, if we compare politics and religion, religion is obviously the more important element here. Every political
Well, yes,
movement, yeah,
and I'm going to add to that. The more that our public consciousness has been um, de-Christianized, um, the worse our state of mind and our state of reference has been.
yes,
The common ground has become a battleground, and and it should not be that way. There should be an underpinning mythos to who a people are and what they stand for, and to have Christianity gutted from the culture and from government and from the public consciousness has been disastrous, and it's demonstrably so, whether you want to admit to that fact or not. And how do we say this? In the earlier times in the earlier decades of this century or the past century, uh, it was ridiculous for someone to say that they were an atheist. It wasn't just considered to be factually incorrect. It was considered to be a source of uh, it was a lack of integrity for you to look at the world around you and say, I am not a Christian, because there was so much that you had to speak of and um, internalize in terms of your culture, in terms of the very words that you would speak. The idea that you were not, at some subliminal level, a Christian man or a Christian individual was simply absurd. And it should be that way. It should absolutely maintain that virtue and that strength. So we do have a lot to be reckoned with, and we've seen what happens when that myth, when that cloth and that weave is pulled from under our feet. It is an ugly, divisive world.
yes,
So
and I think that's something that is a major mistake that has occurred in American politics is that people look at the separation of the institutions and they add to that a separation of the actual thought of religion and politics
yeah,
when it
exactly.
is religion that gives us our virtues.
The separation of church and state from the government and institutions was used as a wedge to separate the religion from the culture, and that was a mistake, and we should not have let it happen.
Indeed. Now, I don't think that the institutions, at least in my perspective, uh, but of course, this could be because I fear being a minority, uh, that the institutions should be united because I look at, and I write a whole chapter about religion. I look at the sectarian conflict that has happened in the past. However, I do think that people need to more actively be religious in how they think about politics because these virtues that politicians like to talk about aren't things that simply exist as matters of policy. These are things that, at least from a Christian perspective, come from God. Or
Well, I'm gonna jump. I'm gonna semi interrupt you. I don't think that people need to be told to view politics in a religious manner. I think that's their instinctive default, and the real problem is these intellectual midwits who think that by detaching their religious sentiment from their politics, that they're doing the world a favor. They're not. If you remove your natural carnal instinct to internalize religious fervor into your political alignment, you're not a full human. And you need to become more human to make the world a better place. You need to actually be honest and whole with yourself. any positive effect. Um, it's what humans naturally do, and the problem with this dynamic isn't that humans don't do it; it's that we're consistently told by the intellectual elites, like again Sam Harris, that you're not supposed to do that, and it's fascinating. He says that he agreed with Trump on virtually every single policy point, but out of a mistaken loyalty to the process of how people get their information, or some loyalty to these institutions, that he needed to be a conscientious objector to Trumpism, is just wrong. You're watching a man fighting his own instincts and hating his fellow man for following their instincts. The problem ain't the instincts. It's the man who thinks that they are above the instincts. That's the issue. So, I'm sorry I cut you off there, but please continue.
Yeah, and I agree in large part that this is something that should be viewed as something that is pretty natural because it used to be the sort of mainstream way people would interact with politics.
Yeah.
For example, you read things like I quote the Basilicon Doron, which is a book that King James wrote to his son on how to be a good king. And the first part of it is entirely about his religious upbringing and how all of that interacts with his nature as a king. And so people used to take a very a religion first approach to politics in that sense. Because if you are a magistrate or a politician, you need to have some way of saying that the things that you are doing as a politician are good things. And that is where religion comes in, not to justify what they're doing, but to for them align themselves with justice, because that's
Yeah.
one of the important things that politicians should do is they should be aligned with justice. And where does how do we define justice? Well, we need to look at uh, religion for that.
Okay. That's that to me that sounds fair enough. Um, so what is the what's the next chapter?
Yeah. Well, since I'm writing to Americans, of course, I talk about liberty, and I make sure to point out that liberty isn't something that people should see as a virtue in itself, which is, I think, a mistake that you see in some areas where you have the people that you might call libertines, that are people that think that they should be able to do anything they want. But liberty is about being able to do good things. That doesn't mean that we should ban every minutia of any bad action people could take, but people,
Well, I mean, we don't
yeah,
want to be the French.
yeah, people need to have an understanding that it is something that comes with responsibility, and
Okay.
that you could say that there's different ways in which people have liberty. People can have a liberty to do something positively. So you could say
Mm-hmm.
to take initiatives. People have a liberty for self reliance. There's a liberty that you get when your property is protected by an authority, and that's a privilege. And then there's the liberty of the protection from foreign threats that is done more together in a society. rather than something that people take on themselves. So there's liberties that people have as individuals, and then there's liberties that can be guaranteed to them from the government. And I think that a major mistake that you see in a lot of movements today is that people simply see liberty as an absolute. But in fact, I would say it's more different types of liberties that need to be in a balance with each other.
Okay. I actually go. I think I'm more extreme than you are on this question. Because I don't view from a conservative perspective, from coming from a conservative paradigm, I don't think things like liberty are prerequisite in any way, shape, or form. I don't think that conservatives are innately or should be innately concerned with your right to do X, Y, or Z, because conservatives don't. We don't care about your rights. Um, I know that's a horrible thing to say as not just a deeply religious person, but also as an American who does value liberty. Um, Liberty should be viewed by a conservative, in my view, as an optimization. It should be viewed as a privilege. It should be viewed as something that we have taken upon ourselves in our societies because it works effectively and promotes good results.
Yes.
But the goal is not liberty itself. The goal is not to have ultimate freedom. The goal is to have stability. And we have found stability in maintaining a balance in which individuals are given the ability to benefit from their self initiative. That's what liberty is.
Yeah.
It's the right to seek your own self interest by your own self initiative and to uh, help yourself and the society around you. That is the core essence of what liberty is. And to apply this idea as widely and as abstractly as possible is, of course, stupid.
Yeah.
It,
And
it, it
that's
is, of
exactly
course,
what I'm criticizing as well.
yes. And so the idea that liberty is this abstract principle that the conservative is bound to is one, a lie. Conservatives don't care about liberty per se. We have discovered that the exercise of liberty has a, a plurality of positive results that we cannot ignore and not implement at a certain level, at a certain tone, and at a certain place. Liberty uh, never, in any conservative paradigm, was a replacement or an override for responsibilities, for duty, for and I think that's it. It's responsibility and duty. And when your liberty became a destabilizing force for not individuals, not the government, but society at large, if the town square decides that you are an impediment, that's where your liberty ends. And I
Exactly.
don't care. I don't care what the Constitution say. And as Andrew Torba says, when it because he got shit on for not being a free speech absolutist because he banned porn from Gab, a move which I, by the way, completely support. Because if you look at it objectively, and you look at um, how these various tech platforms operate, Twitter has pornography, but God help you if you're on the wrong side of things and say the wrong thing. Gab has no porn. And I promise you, you can be left, right, center, Marxist, or fascist. You can say whatever you like. Which one has more free speech? And the answer is always going to be Gab.
Yeah.
And and what Andrew Torba says is, look, you want to tell me that pornography is free speech? Go ahead, put up a projector and play it in the town square. See how far you get. There is a threshold of inconvenience and instability which liberty cannot pass, and that's a good thing. it's it is a natural thing that we as humans we can't defy it. We can't tell it no, because the human creature gets in the way. And this incessant need to deny the creature for absolute uh, mental or philosophical purity is, again, retarded. It doesn't work. Knock it off.
Yeah.
And
So,
so that's this notion that you are bound by a principle or by a virtue like liberty as a conservative when it comes to enacting policy or just simply enforcing a cultural norm, um, is libertarian stupidity. Don't do it.
yeah, and I
Is
don't.
essentially the message.
Yeah, and I will say that uh, I think most of the stuff you just said is stuff that, in other words, I also write in my manifesto. For example, I write, conservatives do not consider liberty to be a virtue in itself. Rather, they see it as a useful and desirable tool for enabling, and I list various things. And then I quote Alexander Hamilton actually criticizing the liberals of his day, where he talks about how people go too far in many different ways because they want liberty, and they don't really have a balanced perspective on how it's
Yeah.
supposed to work, because liberty is good because it's useful. It's not good because it's some higher principle. It's
Well,
some,
I mean,
yeah,
liberty is a great rallying cry for those who are about to take power for themselves. However, when we look at the American Revolution and Alexander Hamilton's time, um, the great contrast between the American Revolution and the French Revolution was that the American Revolution was not a war fought on the idea of a future utopia. The American Revolution was conservative in that they already had what they wanted and they were trying to keep what they had. They were
exactly.
not fighting for a perfect future. They were trying to maintain what they had already built for themselves, in spite of the Holy Crown across the a 6 month voyage across the sea. They were trying to preserve for themselves something which they had already built, and were trying to, in in a more general term, maintain the status quo and saying, look, you are insufficient for governance to these colonies. We would be better off striking out on our own. And lo and behold, we were. Um, so it was not. It the cry for liberty from the Americans wasn't, oh, we're gonna make something better. No, we had already made something better, and we were sick of King George over there mucking things up because he couldn't handle his own shit on his own shores and managing his imperial navy. And we decided, well, we don't want anything to do with that madness. Now, whether that was ingracious or ungrateful or imprudent is, well, irrelevant. We got what we wanted, and at the end, we turned out to be all the better for it. But liberty itself is not something that I think was ever intended to be autistically and philosophically abstracted and then applied in an overall veneer. That's because, as Alexander Hamilton observed, that is a terrible idea. And when you try to apply that idea, as the French have been, you get terrible results. You don't get order. You don't get stability, and that is something that conservatives are intrinsically concerned about. We might not care about your liberty, but we do care about whether you are stable, whether you are happy, whether you are successful, whether you are a functional and happy human is going to be the desired result of a conservative. So so yes, I do approve of the use of Hamilton here.
Yes, and I think that's a major thing that a lot of people don't really consider when they look at the founding fathers. They don't consider that there were disagreements among them, and that you could easily divide them into a more conservative and a less conservative side. So you have, yeah,
What fascinates me is that Benjamin Franklin could work with Alexander Hamilton. That still floors me because because despite Hamilton's writings and despite Hamilton's inclination, uh, Benjamin Franklin loved the French, and I don't think Hamilton shared that adoration. I could be wrong,
yeah,
but I'm just not.
yeah. Hamilton
I don't see it.
Hamilton was more for the pro British faction after the war. Um,
Yeah.
that is to say, to have good relations with Britain, not to rejoin Britain, which at that
Well,
point wasn't politically tenable.
he was he was more economically minded. He was a political realist for his time,
Indeed.
which is why he was shot by Aaron Burr. God ever curse that degenerate soul. Um, so I'm actually very partial to Hamilton's thinking.
Yeah. So do you look into realism a lot?
Is that a trick question?
No, because I do quote some realists myself in the book. Uh,
I think I think the label a realist is can only be counterpointed by um, idealists whose ideas and formulations and theories are not proven and untested and heretofore unworkable with humanity. Um, so it's not about whether I consider myself a realist or whether I study realists. I simply accept reality, and that is that should be a conservative staple.
yeah,
And most people have this conservative sentiment. They don't want to dabble in shit that's well, risky and unproven and potentially disastrous. That is a natural human phenomenon to avoid unnecessary risk, pain, and suffering, or at least it should be, unless your humanity is drilled out of you by a college program of some sort. So I don't consider if you were to label me a realist, it would be very abstract. And I don't study realists because I think it would be preaching to the choir at this point.
yeah. I think a lot of realism really amounts to saying truisms, and I don't think that that's a bad thing necessarily. But if you're already familiar with a lot of that stuff, then it's not really news, you could say.
Yeah, and I cannot confess to having any in depth study into realism.
Yeah. But anyway,
Because yeah,
yeah.
moving on.
Moving on, realists. I quote some of the most well known historical realists: Thucydides, Machiavelli, and
My favorite.
Hobbes.
Now, Machiavelli was an interesting discovery because I grew up in a traditional Italian home, and I didn't know it at first. I because growing up in an authentic ethnic Italian environment, I was not prepared to pick up Machiavelli, someone whose name is reviled among the field of psychology and political philosophy, and realize that I was coming home because this man spoke the way that my family spoke at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Well, we did not speak in terms of, oh, it should be this way or oh, it should be that way. We spoke in terms of, you know, these people are related. What the fuck did you expect? But it was very down to earth. It was very you had to take the human element of people and their psyche and their allegiances, take them seriously, and not and you have no right to expect anything else from human beings other than to be human, to be loyal to themselves, to their family, to their own interests. So the entire notion of idealistic sentiment was drilled out of me from a very very early age. So Machiavelli for me was, well, as I said before, it was like coming home. It was like pouring water from one pitcher into another. Like Machiavelli makes sense to me, and always has.
Yes, I think that his work is very great. I would say in its content, and I also grew up not in an Italian home, but in Italy. So I suppose maybe there's some cultural familiarity in that sense. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where a lot of people criticize Machiavelli because they see him as somebody that tells people how to do mean stuff. But in fact, when you actually look into his work, he is concerned about virtue more than a lot of people credit him for. It's simply that he acknowledges how the world works and that politics isn't simply something that people get into in order to do good things. It is a tool that people can use for good or bad, and that's why we hear things like Stalin. He was an avid reader of Machiavelli, and you can tell that it paid off because he was in power for so long. But anyway, I do
Well,
think
that
that
I
Machiavelli,
have to say that. Oh, go on. Please finish.
yeah, I do think that a lot of people read into the prince more than they should if they would have read Discourses on Livy, which I think offers a much more in-depth perspective on how he views not how politics, not only how politics works, but more how it should work and how to make it work best.
Ah, see, now I'm going to show my ignorance here. I haven't read anything but The Prince from Machiavelli. But if you want to look for Machiavelli's, um shall we say, idealist side when it comes to politics and how he thinks it should work, because I haven't read the Livy at all. But I knew that Machiavelli was concerned about how things should be, so to speak, because when he draws examples about ideal princes and how princedoms should work, uh, the best examples of princes, they were all like so many of them. He had contemporary examples, but the ones that he wanted to in tune his audience with the most were biblical. Moses, King David, and so on and so forth. Uh, the the examples he drew from in scripture as to what made a good prince had a very Christian, very doctrinal, sound understanding that, by the way, was not openly taught by the Catholic Church at that time. Um, his examples clearly had to be drawn from his own reading of the canon. And so when he drew in from these examples to justify uh, his own formulation of political realism, it ruffled a lot of feathers. Because not only was he justifying himself in terms of contemporary examples, he was using scripture to justify political realism when idealism was in vogue, and that was naughty. And we have to admire the brass balls of the man. I
Yeah,
mean, the Prince, just so everyone knows, the Prince is a letter to a potential a young up and coming prince, where Machiavelli essentially says in the foreword, "I have no greater gift to offer you than an entire treatise on on how best for you to do your job. That takes balls, even for Machiavelli's mindset and age. But it was a very Italian move, and that's what the prince is. It's a gift to a prince about how to be a prince.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What I know that we're here, and there was a logical line to how we got here. But take me back to how we got here.
Well, we were going off on a tangent about liberty and idealism and realism, so I started talking about Machiavelli. But anyway,
There we go.
yeah. Uh, anyway, my next chapter is on tyranny, and
Ah,
and I contrast not the general contrast that you would expect from liberals, where it's liberty versus tyranny. I contrast conservatism against tyranny. That is to say, that tyrants are people that uh, can cause much harm to their people and their countries because they essentially reduce the virtue of the order and the prosperity of their countries. And and I
correct.
and I don't take the typical perspective that a lot of people have where they define these in terms of democracy versus autocracy or monarchy. I define it, I say that a king can be a good king and he can be a bad king, just like a republic can be a good republic or a bad republic. Uh, and I
Yes.
and of course I this is where I begin quoting from the Basilicon Doron of King James, where he writes, "For the part of making." By the way, I translated this myself from Scots. For the part of making and executing of laws, consider first the true difference between a lawful good king and a usurping tyrant, and you shall the more easily understand your duty herein. For opposites juxtaposed shine more clearly. The one acknowledges himself ordained for his people, having received from God a burden of government, whereof he must be accountable. The other thinks his people ordained for him, a prey to his passions and inordinate appetites, as the fruits of his magnanimity. And he goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, King James, his perspective is a divine right perspective. However, I think that even if people don't take as hard of a divine right perspective as King James does, people, at least Christians, should acknowledge that they are all accountable to God, even as rulers.
Well, and it is interesting for that King James. How do I put this? I don't fault King James having, obviously from his own writings, a nobler mind, so to speak, when it comes to his rulership and his divine right. The question becomes, and this is an important question: if you have a divine right, why shouldn't your people be subject to your passions and your exploitation, so to speak? That's kind of the double-edged sword of divine right. And I'm not going to I'm going to state the obvious and say that exercising divine right with a king who does act and behave as if his people are ripened for his own exploitation is obviously an evil. So we do have to look at this a little deeper and understand what is happening with one case versus the other. And as I think when I first started the playlist, the true conservatism kind of meditations and exploration, um, the idea is that true conservatives seek stability and they seek prosperity. And the obvious and first objection to this should be, well, all all systems of government and all ideologies seek stability, right? And the answer is No, no, they don't. They do not seek your stability. They don't seek your happiness. They don't seek your growth, your promotion, or your posterity. There are governments, there are principles, there are virtues, and there are ideologies which favor themselves above your stability. And that is the true strength and crux of conservatism. And it is that the ideology ultimately doesn't matter if it's not conservative, because the conservative is solely focused around your stability, your ability to be a successful human being and to have a successful and happy society around you. And there are societies and ideologies which will sacrifice that stability even when they have it in hand for ideological purposes. And that's how you know the difference between a good ruler or a bad ruler, between a good ideology or a bad ideology. When someone is willing to put um, their own ideology and they're willing anything. Let me just summarize it this way: anything that is willing to sacrifice the stability of society, of the human family, of the tribe, and of the individual for their own benefit or for their own ideological bent, it is not going to be inherently conservative. Am I too far off?
I agree that people who look into ideologies, let's say the contrast between realism and idealism, that realists look at the world and they see how it works and they use that to base how they are going to make politics work, whereas idealists instead try to impose how they want the world to work onto the world, and in doing so they risk losing everything. uh,
Yes.
I think that that's a good way to put it. Now, obviously, if we put religion into the mix, there's the idea that there are things that go beyond our prosperity in this life. And I would say a lot of people would say that those things are typically important. Now, at least from a Christian perspective, in this country anyway, I don't see very many conflicts happening between that and how people view the material prosperity of our country. Now, of course, I can see in some other countries there might be a conflict. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but of course, that's something that has to be addressed situationally, because from a Christian perspective, these more eternal concerns are as real as the physical things that we see uh, every day. So they're not things that we should sacrifice for that. However, I think we can both agree that in very many ways we can have these work together. The things we do in this life and the things that we do for eternity can work together. And I think that you, as the carnal conservative, that's certainly something that I think would be important to you. That as a religious person who is also concerned with the physical world that we live in, that we have a vision that these eternal and these temporal things can work together.
Ah, well, I'll be. How do I put this? Um, I find it difficult to separate the two, to be honest. Um, how else can you say? Because in Scripture, it's supposed that man is made in God's image, and that man's society and nature has a spark of divinity within it. I believe that wholeheartedly, and so when we say taking the temporal and making sure that it's in harmony with the spiritual, um, that in my view that just gets a big massive duh. That is intrinsically obvious, at least to my point of view. I don't. Ah, I think that for conservatives, when it comes to harmonizing our eternal and our temporal natures, the answer is, and in my formulation of conservatism, this is called one of the forces that conservatism is concerned with, and one of those forces is called the family. The idea that an organism must A, survive, and B, propagate its own species is necessary for its survival, and to not do this would result in extinction. That is a basic realist fact that you as an organism have to exist, you have to maintain your existence, and you have to pass on your existence to others to maintain the species. And the best way to translate that temporal need into an eternal paradigm is in the passing on of the gift of life, and that becomes family. And conservatives and societies and peoples who don't address, maintain, or care for the family spiral towards extinction. They spiral towards a self annihilation. And this, so when we talk about melding these two things, you are talking about the family. Now, the other force, which we're primarily dealt with, is food. The ability to harness and gather resources for our sustainment uh, and maintenance. You need to gather resources, and from the family, from the force of the family, we have, well, governments, we have police departments, we have family structures, we have the church, we have a bunch of institutions that we have built around the cultural enforcement and happiness and stability of the family. That's what these things are for. Armies are an institution from the government that are built to protect the family.
Yeah. And I think that this actually goes to what I begin to write in the next chapter, where I talk about the state. And I say families are the most basic form of government that people have interaction with.
The family is the basic building block of all, is the basic unit of all society across the world. It, if you don't have family, if you don't have a rich and engaging expectation and cultural norm for the family, you lose. You absolutely lose. And um, there's really there's no replacement. There's nowhere to go after that. You can't say, "Oh well, I've lost a family. Let me find something." There is nothing else. There is no replacement. There's no other option, because, well, it's extinction otherwise. You can't. Human beings will never learn. They will never develop to the point where they can have mass communist birthing pods where we're all just raised in a in a state-run nursery. Humans will never develop that way, and we can get into the biological ons and ends of that later. But it's a basic biological evolutionary truth that human beings, when we first started, I don't know, settling down, making agriculture, and when human beings learned how to farm, we did the most amazing shit. We started moving the earth. We started redirecting rivers. We started irrigation. And this was in a very short span of time, from learning how to farm from one plot of land to moving the earth, to moving mountains, to redirecting rivers. It happened quickly, and it happened so quickly that as a species, we escaped evolution. You have to understand that humanity is post evolution. We do not evolve anymore as a species. We have minor adaptations in terms of germs and malignants, but in terms of how we actually physically interact with this world, our minds, our psyches, and our very beings will not adapt to another paradigm than that which we were when we became an agricultural species. So there is no other future. There is no other development. There is no other paradigm that humanity is going to be successful except for that which we're frozen by when we escaped evolution. And evolution doesn't occur unless there is a need for it to occur, unless there is a life and death scenario. And I'm sorry, but such a scenario doesn't exist. There's no crucible. There's no there's no there's no force to pressure and force humanity as a species to go in another direction. This is it. It's the family or bust. Sorry, end rant.
Yeah, I think the family is supremely important, and it cannot be uh, it cannot be overemphasized how important the family is. And of course, it's something that we see in our society is eroding to some extent among certain elements of a society anyway. Of course, other elements, it's prospering pretty well. But for the love that I have for my countrymen, I hope that everybody learns to appreciate just how important the family is.
Yeah. Amen. That's all I have to say is amen. That's all that there is, and not just the obvious religious sentiment, but there is a carnal temporal need for humans to understand that family is the end all and be all. So get on it. Get to breeding.
Yeah. So anyway, I then have a chapter on foreign relations. So I begin
Ah,
with a classical realist treatment of the topic. I quote Thucydides: "Right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." So ultimately, in international relations, the norms of international relations are rooted in the power of countries. So obviously,
correct.
a strong country is going to have different options than a weak country, and some countries, by nature of their weakness, have to rely on stronger countries or upon each other.
Or become Ukraine.
Yeah, or become Ukraine, which I
Yeah,
think is probably a direction that I would not recommend. Uh,
no, 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 no. The I and as a conservative, when people want to appeal to principles and virtues and all this stuff, when they say Ukraine should be free to do what they want, I'm like, excuse me, there is at no point you cannot claim to be a Ukrainian nationalist and not take into account in your foreign policy maintaining good relations with the bear living fucking next door. Like if your foreign policy did not take into account that you are the bitch of a major superpower living next to you, you're not being conservative. You're being an idiot. And if Ukraine thought that they could have a policy that did not consider good relations with Russia to be part of that policy, they deserve what they get, and that's just reality. And you cannot be conservative and ignore that reality.
Yeah,
And it is and by contrast, and this would never be a question if and I give an example of this in my Mysteries of Conservatism series, where look, there's going to be differences and tensions between various cultures and identities and societies that are different because of whatever geographical and cultural norms that they have. That is a given. The problem with liberals, the problem with neocons, the problem with ideologues of any stripe, anything that is not a true conservative, is that they're going to meet one another and they're going to ask each other, okay, we're going to get along, we're going to try and have treaties and alliances. So, what do you believe? Is going to be the obvious question when you try to discover another culture, another paradigm, and say, all right, let's interact. The problem with all these interactions between these ideologues and these principled people is that they actually mean it. They actually sincerely mean, what do you believe when trying to engage and interact with one another. By stark contrast, when true conservatives are represented in both societies, so both societies choose to be represented by ambassadors who are true conservatives, the difference is, what they're going to do is they're going to say the same words. They're going to have the same kind of dialogue. Oh, what are your customs? What do you believe? Here's the difference. True conservatives, when they listen to this exchange, they don't actually care about what you believe. We genuinely don't care what you believe. When we ask what you believe, what we are expecting and what we're translating, what we're looking for is, how do you survive? And from that point, true conservatives can come together and have amicable relations easily, without much controversy, without much hubbub. It is easy for true conservatives to get along because they don't see each other as ideological or principled paragons. They see each other as humble fellow survivors of the forces of this world. And that's what makes the conservative more capable and tolerant and peaceful than the ideological counterpart. So, the best way to have a foreign policy is to have a conservative impetus behind it.
indeed.
This is about. I don't. I'm not. I haven't read your essay, and I'm not commenting on your essay. This is just my bullshit coming out of my head. So, what does your essay say on the matter?
Well, I point out that some of the most successful diplomats in history, and that would be people like Clemens von Metternich, John Quincy Adams, and Otto von Bismarck. They were not concerned about idealistic ideas on how they want to restructure the world to be perfect. They were concerned about the relationships of power between countries, what countries were strong, what countries were weak, and establishing spheres of influence for those countries and respecting those spheres of influence. Um, I don't talk so much about the internal psychology, though.
Ah, you see, I do find that conservatism is far more tolerant and peaceful because they are rooted in, dare we say, reality, and they are, again, because they're rooted in reality and they're rooted in accurately assessing a nation's strengths, customs, traditions, and how they survive, um, it creates a more natural, honest dialogue and exchange. So let me see if, because here's what floors me. When I made this formulation about true conservatism and international relations and tolerance, um, I had no data to support it. None. That this was, ironically, a theory postulated just from me observing how conservatives interact with people they disagree with in real life. Um, so I'm pleased to hear that my observations are not bullshit. But you do have examples in your manifesto of, shall we say, conservative-leaning diplomats.
Yes, and very successful ones, I might add, because
Well, then
they managed
I'm
to secure peace quite effectively. For example, von Metternich, he established the order of peace after the Napoleonic Wars, which lasted for quite a long time and is considered one of the most peaceful periods in recorded history. And then you have John Quincy Adams, who is the main architect of the Monroe Doctrine.
yeah.
And then you have Otto von Bismarck, who created a political order that secured a general peace between European powers, at least until World War One. So I would say that they were all relatively successful and highly esteemed among people that study international relations. Anyway,
And you would lump these individuals as people of a conservative nature.
I would say that they were certainly the all among the conservative side of their societies.
Okay. Well, that does make sense, and I'm not surprised to hear that people of conservative leanings are capable of establishing and maintaining long-term peace. That personally comes as no shock to me whatsoever. Even though I'd made the assertion with no evidence or knowledge of myself, it doesn't surprise me. And in fact, it falls in line with my theory on that. Because as I said, conservatism is primarily concerned with the stability of its people. What benefit would it have making other societies unstable as well?
Well, I think not a lot.
Exactly. If you make people's lives uncomfortable elsewhere, they will come and make yours unstable as well.
Yeah, and that's a criticism I levy against current American foreign policy, which
Oh my
has
God.
they have done that quite a bit, and I think
Well, and
yeah. Go ahead.
it's how you know that we have no true conservative leadership. I mean, well, Ronald Reagan, by contrast to John Bolton and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, it was Ronald Reagan who went over to Russia and had peace talks with the people who were running Russia at the time. I mean, the Trump effect is not new. It's not new.
Or Nixon with China.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that one.
Yeah, not the best, but
that one leaves no. I am not condoning that one in any way, shape, or form. But when Ronald Reagan went to Russia and said, we need to talk, Russia took him seriously. They had talks, and especially with this whole scenario going down with Ukraine and all the misinformation surrounding that debacle and the politics that led up to it, so on and so forth. I think what we are seeing from the Eastern European bloc from Russia is and I know this is going to sound contradictory to some of you, is a conservative, measured, and hesitant stepping away from what can now be described as historical communism, and a conservative tiptoeing into Western capitalist paradigms where they can be more stable, be more successful, but they're not going to do it whole hog. And at least that's what I'm seeing when I look at Putin's Russia, and when I look at their development as a nation that is trying to escape a former paradigm that was a failure. And what we have to understand is that ideological states like Russia was and is escaping, they don't care about your stability. And so the people of Russia have been absolutely decimated in terms of morale, in terms of identity, in terms of their economic prosperity. They haven't had anything.
Yeah, and their willingness
And
to
it,
produce as well.
yes, and it's yeah, that's a tragic thing to happen to any people, and they are slowly trying to tiptoe their way out of that. And I see it as a stable, methodical, conservative effort to escape that paradigm. And so I look at Russia with optimism in terms of their future, in terms of their success as a nation state. I think they are they're definitely on the rise. They're definitely in the ascendant, and it would be foolish to dismiss their resolve. It would be foolish uh, to dismiss them as to simply wave them away as communists, because if they were still truly communists, they wouldn't be they wouldn't have any success. They wouldn't have any stability. And so we need to have clear eyes and steeled minds when assessing that situation.
Yeah, and
Also, go on.
yeah, I was just going to say I agree that they are certainly not communist in what they're doing. However, as to whether their future looks bright, I think they're going to have a pretty hard time with their demographics. I think a lot of analysts are saying that. Uh, so they're trying to
Well,
stabilize before that happens.
yes, and you know what? I saw that Russia said that they're going to offer like 1 million rubles to women with 10 or more children. I would also throw in there the make them taxes exempt for life. Um, in terms of encouraging procreation. Um, Russia's return to the Eastern Orthodox is not insignificant. And you have to remember, we only do census once every 10 years. I'm not sure when Russia does it, but the current figures are abysmal. However, we have to remember that those figures are somewhat antiquated. They're gonna there's a definite time delay in the ability we in the information we have that is available for population growth, and it goes usually a decade behind. um, I think that as Russia has moved away towards communist ideology in favor of a more shall we say theological foundation rather than an ideological one, that there is a chance that they are recovering faster than we think. And I honestly hope that's the case. I don't relish in the idea of a people who are finding their way out of ideology to suffer needlessly. That just leaves a very bad taste in my mouth. The Russian people, as a people, um, they don't deserve annihilation. They don't deserve extinction. They're just people like you and I.
Yeah,
And so it's I would hope that that they are already on the mend in terms of their reproductive their reproduction rates. That to me seems like we might be behind the curve in terms of our data.
Yeah, I suppose it is worth looking at the optimist perspective on that. It's just that based on what we currently have, it certainly looks like they have a lot of momentum to reverse on that.
I I'll be honest, I can't say I disagree. Now there was another point that I was going to make, and I forgot what it was. Oh well, it'll come to me later.
Yeah.
Um, but it was on. Well, we're on the topic of international relations.
Yes.
No, I plumb forgot it. So let's cover one more chapter, and then we'll continue this another time.
Sure. I'll go to the community. I think
Ah,
I think that's something that not only the family is important, but the community is something that's very important. Something that is slowly eroding because people can talk about various disagreements that people have about what certain policies that they should have. But if you look at it more from a community centered perspective, it's a lot easier to resolve those disagreements by simply choosing to let people separate on how they want to accomplish their goals, especially when we talk about economics, uh, because there's a lot of wacky people with wacky ideas about economics, and I think it's a big hassle to have to fight over economics on the scale of the whole country.
now I I do agree that economics is important, and that the community does serve a an important function there. Um, but that's not where my. But when we talk about um, but when we talk about community, um, and this is conjoined with economics. Make no mistake. You can't have you cannot have this not be an economic factor or an economic facet. The community is nothing more than a conglomerate of families,
Yeah,
and in these interlocking relationships of different families growing in and around one another, the community has to self-regulate in terms of quality, trustworthiness, in terms of virtue, in terms of trust, in terms of um, skill. And so you're right. There's a marvelous economic aspect to this in terms of these numerous families working in with one another. However, there is also the aspect of um, trustworthiness and social standing and social virtue, and not just upliftment, but shall we say, cultural enforcement between one another. Oh, pardon me, I have an alarm going off. Um, there's also this aspect of a of this community growing holistically and being able to uh, really determine for that community what is optimal for their own benefit, for their own health, for their own well-being. And so what we're talking about families having their own identity and ethos within the community.
yeah,
And we have to understand it through that lens. And to break it down, the greatest disservice, from one of the greatest disservices from the Enlightenment, was taking this family dynamic and breaking it down into individualism. And my God, what a failure! um, I truly believe that to be one of the greatest tragedies, is that we have taken something that has been, your family name should mean something to your community, and it should mean something to you. And if it doesn't, that is your problem, and that is a blight on your person. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that is, individualism needs to become a new curse, because that's what it is. It's a curse. It is, if you are no longer a member of your family or of your tribe or of your, it means the rejection of the family. It is a rejection from the community, because you are rejecting your power, you're rejecting your ethos, you're rejecting the source from which you sprang.
Yeah. And
And
the
the idea that,
symbiosis that you have with other members of
yes,
society.
and okay, look, throughout all of human history, we all agree, acknowledge, and accept that within families there are black sheep. And you know what? The community makes room for that naturally. Well, the weirdo, the reject, that happens, and society has a way, the community has a way of adapting around them. Sometimes it's pretty, sometimes it's not so pretty. But when a son or daughter of a family decides, I'm going to reject my family, that generally means that you're out of the community. And it's different from saying I'm walking away from my family to I'm trying to fit in with my family. Those are two different ethos. Those are two different paradigms that that the Enlightenment and classical liberalism has unjustly meddled in.
Yeah. And
It
it,
was not. It is not your place as a philosopher to right that wrong. Get the fuck out of our space.
yeah. So anyway, one person I quote extensively on the community is the German political philosopher Johannes Althusius from the late 16th, early 17th century. And
Hmm.
I'll quote here: the members of a community are private and diverse associations of families. And I'll skip over communication among citizens of the same community for the purpose of self sufficiency and symbiosis pertains to things, services, right, and mutual concord. Whence arises this political order or the symbiotic right of the city, which is called the legal order of the city. And he uses Latin terms as well. So he understands that the community is composed of not simply individuals but families and other types of
Yes.
associations, and that together there is a symbiosis that occurs. That is, people people aren't all subsistence farmers in an advanced society. People have different professions. People help each other when they're in trouble, and doing this from, let's say, a top down continent wide perspective is a lot harder and also a lot less uh, personal and caring than it is to do it from that community level.
Yeah, and but before we, with your permission, to tune off, I'm going to add one more aspect to this discussion of community, and it is this: we need to more firmly reject this horrible paradigm where we have traded, and this is not a conservative, and the reason this needs to be brought up is because conservatives need to realize that they are being forced to support something that is not inherently conservative in any way, shape, or form. And what we need to tear down and restore is this idea that the free the free market, the free for all economy is somehow preferable to the ancient model of inheritance, especially in terms of land, in terms of housing, in terms of your identity as an individual and tying it to a place. It is evil that we have allowed our community and our identities as individuals and families be so radically atomized that we are that we're driven by money rather than where the heart is, and that is that's not stable. That's not healthy. That's not wholesome. And most societies, and it's one of the signs of our society and age and decline is when families don't have homes in perpetuity.
Yeah, they don't have
It,
roots.
exactly. So that there are a few, because I've been trying to discover the how do I put this? I've been trying to discover where we went wrong with the Enlightenment, and I do have theological leanings on that question. But the three of them were: we traded the family for the individual. We've traded um, we've traded inheritance for a free fall economy, and we've traded what was the third one? It was a big one too. What was the first one that I named off?
Uh, you were talking about the family, and you were talking about inheritance.
Yeah, that was it. We traded the family. Oh, we traded the family for individualism. We traded inheritance for free market, free fall, and we also traded the idea of a covenant with the illusion of rights. And if you don't understand the difference, you need to understand that a covenant is something that is continually acknowledged, continually remembered, it is measured, and it is maintained. And if the covenant is not upheld, you get violent, you react, you fight to have.
You're breaking up. You
Give me a
broke up
moment.
there. Repeat.
Okay, I should be back now.
Yeah.
It turned green again. And okay, so let me just repeat myself. We have we have replaced the notion of covenants and that of the covenant, something that is remembered, something that is valued, cherished, and then not only just cherished, but measured and maintained. The covenant is a contract between ruler and people. It is a contract between God and people. It is a contract between families. These are like marriages are covenants. To give an example, and they are measured and then they are maintained. And covenants can, in actuality, be broken. And when they're broken, you have a moral impetus to react, to get violent, to fix and to replace and to renew this thing that was lost. And we've traded that for the illusion of something that we've called rights. And the tragedy is when your rights are taken from you, what is your recourse? What is your response? Where is your reaction? What is your just cause? And the answer is there isn't one. And so, as I've gone through my personal musing as to where we went wrong with the Enlightenment, those are the three things, and they're pretty big, and they're not and adapting these new paradigms, adapting the atomization of the individual, um, trading inheritance for free fall economy, for trading the covenants for rights. These are not conservative things, and they are things that we need to reject and work ourselves back to, because they are good conservative paradigms that maintain the stability of a people and a civilization.
Indeed. So anyway, since we are wrapping up now, I thank you very much for coming on. I have linked your YouTube channel in the description. If you'd like me to link something else, you can tell me, and I'll do that later as well. Since this was a bit impromptu, I didn't go through everything. But anyway, it's been great having you. I think that we certainly had a lot of points of agreement, maybe some points of different perspectives on certain issues. And I think that's good. I think it's constructive to the conservative movement to have these types of discussions. And I look forward to having these types of discussions with other individuals as I prepare to publish my book, which will be coming out soon. So
Well,
anyway, yeah, go ahead.
okay, and I hope that this conversation was helpful to you, to the audience, and to the book. We did have a lot of similarities. I had some questions about how you formulated some of your positions, but all in all, it sounds very good. I wish you the best.
Thank you very much. Anything else you'd like to say before we go?
Um, we might be having a stream on the Carnal Conservative tomorrow in terms of the new role play, the Shades of Dominion. Fun will be had. I'm just going to shill that for a moment here, and we hope to see you there.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So anyway, our beautiful and wonderful audience, thank you very much for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time. Anavultus over and out.